We are here on the Danube in Budapest at the Danube Institute with a Danube Institute podcast on Israel's relations to China and the US. And I'm here with my guest, Elie Pieprz, who's the director of international relations of the Israel Defense and Security Forum, an activist NGO committed to Israeli national security. And you previously directed political campaigns in various countries, including in the United States.
Correct.
And we'll talk about Israel in relation to China, Chinese and the United States, and how the geopolitical rivalry between the two superpowers plays out in Israel, and what effects it has on Israel's security position. But first, I need to make two brief notes. Congratulations. I congratulate you and Israel for this great feat of intelligence with great precision. You have taken out the entire leadership of Hezbollah, including the General Secretary Nasrallah. Nasrallah and Hezbollah are an enemy of both Israel and the West. So this is an amazing development, and I must say quite surprising as well. I mean, we knew that the Israeli military was competent, but we didn't know a modern army was capable of doing something like this. And secondly, we are here in Budapest, and if you speak about Israel in Budapest, there are a few context factors that need to be mentioned. This is, of course, the city in which Zionism was founded as an idea. Herzl lived in what's nowadays called the Jewish neighborhood, or what at the time was also known as the Jewish neighborhood. There's still a Jewish community. I live in the Jewish neighborhood in Pest. You still have the Orthodox Jews there with their beautiful black hats. I wear hats sometimes, and then sometimes they sneakily look at me and they're like, "Is he one of us?" And then no, he's not one of us. So I get the little eye contact on the street. But of course, Budapest is also at the center of the Holocaust. One of the most horrible episodes in the Holocaust unfolded here in Budapest. More than 400,000 Jews were deported to Auschwitz in 1944 when the Wehrmacht, the German army, invaded Hungary, and together with Hungarian National Socialists oversaw the rapid deportation of the Jewish population. And of course, the Jewish population of Budapest wasn't just any population, but was a spectacularly successful and creative community. So this was a very dark chapter. Therefore, I think it is particularly important that nowadays Jews seem to be doing very well in the city. So it's still Budapest still houses one of the largest Jewish communities, and the Danube Institute, under the leadership of our researcher Jeffrey Kaplan, has done a research into anti-Semitism in contemporary Hungary, because sometimes it happens everywhere. It happens everywhere, but there's also a bit of a misleading image that has been created in the Western European and North American press about Hungary, where they pretend sometimes that anti-Semitism is rampant. So we had two big studies on this, 2 big volumes. We've seriously looked into it with our researchers, and it turns out the conclusion is all agreed, so all the experts that were interviewed, that the situation for Jews in Hungary has vastly improved over the last decade, and the Jews were more secure in Hungary than in any other country, save Israel, with a large Jewish population. So that's very hopeful, especially given the dark history of this city.
Indeed.
What's your personal relationship with Budapest?
So, Eric, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. One of the things that I now live in, I grew up in the States. For the last 14 years, my home has been in Israel. One of the things that we do not have in Israel is autumn. and to come to visit you here at the beautiful Danube Institute headquarters, as you said, on the banks of the Danube River, with a real crisp air and feel in the air, is something that's very enjoyable, particularly because the last time I was here was exactly 51 weeks ago. I was here on the week of October 9th. Just 2 days after October 7th.
Oh.
It was a trip that had been scheduled in advance. And since I was one of the only Israelis who did not have military experience, I was not able to be helping out with the military component of what Israel was dealing with. I continued on to Budapest and had some meetings here talking about what we thought was going to be going on. To come back 51 weeks later, in the way that you said, literally in the aftermath of one of Israel's biggest successes. 51 weeks ago, there was a very humble Israel. There was an Israel that was reeling from the biggest devastation probably since the Holocaust, which you also referenced to. And in 51 weeks, we have reasserted ourselves, built a confidence, and hopefully reestablished a certain fear amongst our enemies, which is not a fear to try to humiliate them in any kind of real way. It's a way to try to create a sense of calm, a sense of de-escalation, a sense that we are going to win and be victorious, and to remove the idea from our enemy's mind that we could be kicked out of here. Because that ultimately is, there are certain differences, but some of the similarities between what Israel faced on October 7th and what the Jews in Budapest and throughout Europe faced during the Nazi onslaught was this idea was that the Jews could be destroyed. Our enemies on October 7th thought that they could destroy us. They wanted to destroy us. They thought the ring of fire that was surrounding Israel would destroy us. And at this point, I don't think that is a viable thought that they have right now. I think more of the question is, how do they survive? How are they going to try to survive? And that's a much better, in basically a year, we've been able to upset the apple cart completely. So it really is very refreshing and much more exciting to be here now at this point. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have a nice conversation with you.
Yeah, wow. I didn't know that you were here just after October 7th. That must have been quite something.
Very, very moving. Yeah.
Yeah. Now October 7th was first, of course, very shocking. But after the shock came, of course, a sense of disappointment. All kinds of things had gone wrong. Now, probably one of the lesser disappointments at the time was felt in the Israeli China watcher community, where there was a sense of disappointment with China's stance. So before October 7, China and Israel had been moving towards an improved relationship. They already had quite a strong relationship. Israel was the first country to recognize the People's Republic of China of the Western countries, and it was or at least it was very, very early. It was very early in recognizing the People's Republic of China, and in recent years created strong business ties. And there was a lot of technological transfer. There was a lot of knowledge transfer going on. And then after October 7, a few days later, an Israeli diplomat was stabbed in Beijing by a foreign national. And the Chinese news did report on it, luckily, but the Israeli foreign ministry expressed deep disappointment over the fact that the Chinese foreign ministry did not condemn the attack by Hamas on October 7th. And Tuvia Gering, who's a researcher at the Diane and I'm so bad with names. I'm missing up from up here. The Diane and Guilford Glaser Foundation for Israeli and China Policy. He also used that word disappointment, but he said he was not surprised, given that he is a full-time Israel-China watcher, a professional. He was not surprised, given the political and ideological trajectory of China, and the fact that China, of course, has strong relations with Iran, tries to maintain its relations with the Muslim world. has a rivalry with the United States. So he was not surprised, but still he was disappointed. Did you get a sense of the disappointment in your circles, in circles in Israel and your foreign policy circles? Have you come across a disappointment with China's stance?
It's a great question. As you mentioned, Israel generally has a policy. Israel has some friends in the allies in the world, Hungary being one of the leaders amongst them, but also has many enemies. And historically, when countries and certainly superpowers have looked at Israel, they look at them in contrast to the many Arab nations that are surrounding Israel and see Israel as their enemy. And whether that's true or not true, whether Israel actually is the enemy of many Arab countries, certainly some, but I think a growing number of Arab countries now see Israel more as a potential ally, a future collaborator in a positive way. We saw that had a very strong influence in the Soviet Union. That was part of their attitude, was initially they thought that Israel was going to be an ally of the Soviet Union because so many of the founders of Israel, as you had mentioned, came from some came from here in Budapest, but many came from the Soviet Union itself. And they thought that this was going to be, came from Russia. They thought Israel was going to be a natural ally for them. And very quickly they made the calculation that even if Israel would be an ally of the Soviet Union, there were many, many more Arab countries. They had much more resources that they were more interested in, and they decided to make a switch. Yeah. We see a very similar attitude.
If I just may interrupt, the switch was with the Six-Day War. Is that correct?
Yeah, until it was about the Six-Day War. Then certainly by 1973, they were all in against Israel. But there was already changes that were happening when Israel wasn't as receptive. Because then until really the Six-Day War, Israel's primary allies was often the Czech Republic and France. Then you had 1956, and then things changed, and the U.S. only really started getting involved with Israel back in the Six-Day War. That was a big inflection point. With China, we saw a very similar approach, where there was a tremendous amount of respect for Israeli ingenuity, the work ethic that you'll see between Israelis and Chinese. You're going to see a lot of similarity. And Israel is always open to looking for allies internationally, and there was certainly a friendlier approach that many other Western countries didn't have towards China. Israel made an effort to try to do so, but we started to see a similar approach that China started making, where they started investing more heavily with Arab countries. They need a lot of the resources, the energy resources that come from many Arab countries. And one of the ways they try to do so is by trying to engage more and more on behalf of the Palestinian cause in a way that would engage and endear them to many other Arab countries. And particularly when it came to October 7th, we did not see a strong condemnation of October 7th. We saw almost an understanding of what happened, which is very hard for Israelis to appreciate. And then things, I think, went not in the best direction from terms of Israeli-Chinese relations from there. It did not go in the best direction. It continued moving in that direction, where China continued to engage and in trying to push for a Palestinian state at this exact moment without any kind of accountability from the Palestinians. Again, not pushing the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, to condemn October 7th, to express sympathy with Israel. We didn't see any of that, and we saw the Chinese moving headlong into a way that was trying to ingratiate them with Israel's enemies. So we see that as quite problematic.
Could you say that final sentence again? Because that was quite striking. You said that they're embroiling themselves with Israel's enemies.
Yeah, we see that they're trying to endear themselves to many of Israel's enemies in the Arab world. And again, certainly Israel has had the ability to decompartmentalize. You have Israel has allies with countries that also have relations with some of our enemies. That can be done in a way that is constructive. Yeah. We don't expect any country to be only aligned with Israel. We understand every country has their own, certainly a superpower like China. But it seemed like it was being done in a way that was a little bit more pointed, and a little bit more trying to demonstrate that they are separating themselves from Israel. And when Israel needs loyal partners. And certainly while Israel is at war, and it's natural for Israel to be a little more sensitive and a little bit more aware when countries are not supporting Israel from a moral perspective and certainly from a general support perspective, we see a growing Russian, Chinese, Iranian axis, which is a major problem. We see that China has been helping Iran with some of their weapons. We found some Chinese weapons in the tunnels in Gaza. These are all very, very problematic. And then you add on to that the diplomatic efforts by China to engage with the Palestinians and put Israel in a negative light. That's not a good combination of facts over the last year or so.
Yeah, for sure. But then the question, of course, with this Chinese, Russian, Iranian axis is how deeply integrated it really is, and to what extent it is superficial or merely opportunistic. Yeah. Now, I've lived in China for 5 years, and when I lived in China, in Beijing, I was actually struck by how positively the Jews were perceived in China, but in a very curious way, especially from a European perspective, in a way that is almost awkward, because they would in East Asia, you see this more generally, there would be these lingering. There would be these lingering stereotypes about Jewish people that were originally exported by Europeans. These are still going around, but they're often given a positive spin.
Yes.
So I've written a book published by Brill, I think it was 2018, called Life Advice from Below, where I looked at self-help coaches in various countries, and I had a case study focused on China. And in China, at the self-help market. So these are books on how to improve your life, how to become happy, how to have a successful business. There was a subgenre of Jewish advice books. And here are some of the titles. Crack the Talmud, 101 Jewish Business Rules, The Illustrated Jewish Wisdom Book, Know All of the Money-Making Stories of the Talmud, and one pirated version of Daniel Lapin's Daniel Lapin's book had. So I think it was not on the original, but in Chinese it had the phrase, "The money of the world is in the pockets of the Americans, but the money of the Americans is in the pockets of the Jews." And there's an advertisement. So read this book, because the Jews know all about money, and you can learn from them. And also in East Asia, a lot of women have cosmetic surgery to make their noses bigger, because big noses are considered. So everything, everything about the Jews is good, but now, of course, there's a bit of a different narrative alongside this more positive or inverted occidentalizing narrative. Let's put it like this. So this image of the success, the money making, intelligent Jew that you can learn from. This narrative is now put alongside a more politicized narrative where the same kind of stereotypes are suddenly given their original, more negative spin.
Yes. So it's actually interesting that you say this. There is always a tremendous amount of respect, as I mentioned earlier, from Chinese culture to Jewish culture. The idea of money in Jewish culture is all about building relationships. The way that you can earn money legally is by doing something or providing a service or something that somebody wants. So you're providing a service for someone, you're giving a pair of shoes that somebody wants, and then you're making them happy. It's the one act when you make money where God smiles, because both the receiver and the giver end up happier than they were beforehand. If you buy a pair of shoes, the person who walks away with a pair of shoes is happy because he's got a pair of new Nikes that he's very happy to be wearing. And the store owner is happy because he has more money than he had beforehand. So both sides from a legal transaction ends up happier. And when God smiles when his children are cooperating away, that both sides work away happy. That's the general Jewish idea towards money. And I don't know so much in China, but I know that in Korea, they actually had who actually mandated studying the Talmud as something they had to do. And one of the things, I actually had hosted a group of, I think it was mostly Koreans. I don't believe there were any Chinese there, but I believe it was mostly Koreans who came to Israel to visit schools that studied the Talmud. And they said something that was very unique. Said, you go to libraries around the world and it's ubiquitous. You go to a library and somebody says, shh, shh, quiet, we're studying. There's a library. When you go to a library where you're studying the Talmud, it's very loud. People are yelling at each other. How? Because when you study the Talmud, you can't study it by yourself. You have to study it with someone else, and you're arguing, and you're debating, and you're discussing. The culture of how we study is through debate, through engagement, through challenging one another. And I think it was that idea of how you study, not in a solitary way, but in a collaborative way, I think is something that they wanted to esteem and they wanted to adhere to. I don't know if that was something that was maintained and incorporated by both either the Chinese or the Koreans, but I know that is something that's always fascinated them.
It's very hard for them to fully incorporate it because in East Asia, you don't have a strong argumentative culture. So people don't, in families and in public life, people tend not to argue with each other. So South Korea is democratized, so you have a bit of that.
Interesting.
But not so much. And in China, it's still the parts, the places where you argue. Those occasions are very rare. I mean, I worked at Peking University in Beijing, and you have a rank, you have a system, you have clans, and who's going to argue? You can have personal conversation. You can argue one-on-one in a room, but you're not going to publicly argue with anyone. That would just destroy the hierarchy. That would just go against everyone's intuition.
Fair enough. But I think that was part of the mystique. Yeah. That was part of the secret sauce of the Jewish people's success. Yeah. But getting back to your points about how solid is this axis? Is it just an alliance of convenience, or there's something more to it between Iran, Russia, and China? Yeah. And I think I would agree with your implication that I think it is something that is not solid by any stretch. It is something that is convenient. Mm. And I would potentially argue, and I'm optimistic, that as you introduce this segment, talking about congratulating Israel for destroying Nasrallah and frankly the entire, really decapitating Hezbollah, that's the kind of thing that I think China would respect. And you might be more in a position to express whether that's accurate or not. But I think that when you start looking, if this really is an alliance of convenience, and the sense was that until last week or 2 weeks ago, Israel was kind of on the receiving end. Israel was pushing back but not taking the initiative. Over the last 2 weeks, we've seen Israel becoming much more aggressive, much more successful, and seeing Israel's enemies unable really to respond. At that point, when you look at the convenience, certainly there are still, Israel does not compare to many of the Arab countries around it in terms of what it can do when it comes to oil and other energy sources. From a market perspective, obviously there are many, many, many more Arabs than there are Israelis. From a technological perspective, from an ability to push out and not to, I think that respect from the Chinese is something that I look forward to seeing over the coming weeks and months, whether there's going to be a little bit of a change and a certain respect that Israel will have gained from China, and that harkens to a very much more productive future.
Yeah, I hope so. And of course, what you ultimately want to see is a situation where outside powers are not tempted to see the region as one where you have to choose between Israel and the Arab countries, but you would choose the Arab countries and Israel. So hopefully, if relations improve, we would see a different outside perspective on the region.
Agreed.
But if China's attitudes will change, they're going to have to change from the top, because this change that has occurred recently also came from the top. It was Xi Jinping who said, and then everyone is very attentive to what Xi Jinping says, of course, and then it gets echoed and it triples and it goes down the ranks. And what he said is all the problems in the Middle East are relating to the Palestinian issue, and the Palestinian issue can easily be solved if Israel would only talk to these nice guys called Hamas that are being invited over for diplomatic sessions in Beijing, because they have defined Hamas not as a terrorist organization as the EU and the United States and the United Kingdom has, but they have said that Hamas is just a political organization with whom you can have legitimate dealings. From that, if that assumption it's a false assumption, but if that assumption would be true, then Israel could just bargain, negotiate with Hamas, and then things could be worked out. Of course, everything about this is false. The assumption is false, but also the notion that all the problems of the Middle East relate to the Palestinian issue, which is absolutely false. It's laughable. But if the top guy in China sends that out, then everyone has to. So you have all these Israel experts and Middle Eastern experts in China that somehow they have to compromise with this position taking by Xi Jinping. So even though they know better, they have actual experts in China all echoing these points, even though it makes no sense whatsoever, because you have Shiites versus Sunni issue, you have Syria being a mess, you have Libya being a mess. Like, all these problems are not directly related to the Palestinian issue at all.
It's a very lazy analysis that was initiated by those in the West, and then unfortunately now China has picked it up as well. I agree. It will have to come down from the top, but I also think that, again, the developments over the last few days and weeks have been really tectonic. One of the things, again, I don't know how much play it has gotten here in Budapest, but immediately after the news of Nasrallah being killed was publicized, there were celebrations throughout much of Syria. There were celebrations in Iran. I think what is going to start happening is it is becoming much clearer and become much more evident to leaders like the Chinese leader that the Arab world actually is not oriented against Israel. There are jihadi elements that are, but that's not the entire country. The entire countries. Lebanon is in a critical moment in its history. They probably have days or weeks where some more dramatic activities could happen, where if Lebanon is able to free themselves from the yoke of Hezbollah, we will see something quite dramatic, because many in the Lebanon understand that Israel as an enemy is not in Lebanon's best interest, whether they want to be friendly with Lebanon or they don't want to be an enemy. They want to be friendly with Israel or they don't want to be an enemy of Israel. That was the approach that Egypt took back in 1979 when they made peace with Israel. They realized they don't want to be fighting with Israel. The other alternative is to follow the role of the UAE and Bahrain, who on their own, many years before the Abraham Accords were signed, made a strategic decision that they said they were more aligned with Israel than not aligned with Israel. There was no reason for them to be encumbered by the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It didn't necessarily impact them. They actually saw that them aligning with Israel was better in their confrontation with Iran. And therefore, they made a strategic decision that they wanted to change things to allow, when the political window opened for them, they could immediately seize on that opportunity. Lebanon has a choice. It could do one or the other. There are some within Lebanon that have very close ties with Israel. There are some in Lebanon that understand that Hezbollah has been a terrible yoke. And they are at an opportunity right now where there could be some significant changes. And we'll also see what kind of unrest is going to happen in Iran. There's a lot that could be happening and changing over the coming weeks.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking for a phrase because I know the Arab phrase. So I was going to say inshallah, but is there a beautiful Hebrew phrase for this?
Bezrat Hashem. God willing. Yes.
Then we'll end on that. And thank you very much for being here and giving us your thoughts.
It was absolutely my pleasure, and I look forward to coming back again. Thank you.